Well, hello, and I'm so excited to be here at Devex World with Ray Dalio. Of course, Devex World is the moment when we try to think about the future and what's coming, and nothing is more emblematic of that than Ray and the way he thinks about the world and his book, which is really making waves, I think, across so many sectors, including our own here in global development, and that's Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order. And the subtitle is Why Nations Succeed or Fail. Many of you know Ray, of course. He founded Bridgewater Associates, which is the world's largest hedge fund. And he's a big thinker on the kind of underlying principles that all of us need to think about as they apply to our lives, our business, our work, and the world. He's also a signer, an original signer of the Giving Pledge, and is very active in philanthropy. Ray Dalio, it's just such a great pleasure to get to spend a few minutes with you today.
Oh, I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thanks. Yeah. So maybe we could just start with the book. You look at 500 years of history and you say there's some big cycles, some patterns that repeat themselves. We might not recognize them in our own lives right now, but they've happened over time. And you focus in on three things that are new. Maybe just briefly tell us, what are those three new things going on right now? And then we could think about what are the implications for the whole world.
Yeah. I learned through my experiences that many of the times I was surprised were because of things that never happened to me before in my lifetime, but happened many times in history. And the three things that drove me to study this 500 years of history and the patterns were, first, the creation of an enormous amount of debt and the monetization of that debt. Second, the amounts of internal conflict between populists of the right and populists of the left, with the largest wealth and income gap since the 1930s. And third, the rise of a great power, comparable power to the United States in the form of China, to create a great power conflict between not just the United States and China, but also its allies. All three of those things I knew happened the last time in the 1930 to 45 period, but that's a sample size of one. And I needed to see the sample size of many cases. So I studied 10 major empires, the 10 most important ones, going back the last 500 years. And then I studied the dynasties in China since the Tang Dynasty, which is 600, to see that pattern and that cycle. And so, as you can imagine, each one is an issue. Each one is a problem. And when those three problems come together, that's a dangerous set of circumstances. So that's what prompted me to look at those patterns in history. And I saw that
Is really relevant, given that all the institutions in global development, the World Bank and the IMF and all of these other institutions that deal with global poverty, they were set up because of that last great conflict. World War II and the aftermath of that, Bretton Woods was created. And there are a lot of people who talk about, do we have the right structure today? Is it fit for purpose? And it seems like a lot of what you're saying is we're at this moment in history now where there could be another inflection. There could be another great conflict. Things might really shift, and the structure of the world, the way we understand it and know it, it might get pushed kind of over an edge into something new. Talk a little bit about that. Is it necessarily kind of a war between the US and China? Because that's how a lot of people have interpreted your book. Or is there something else that you think might happen right now?
Yeah. So the patterns that we see in history have cause-effect relationships. It's not so much the patterns, because that would just require blind faith that the patterns continue. But you could see the cause-effect relationships at each time and seeing those. And I'm a very practical guy. Like, I'm doing this not to study history. I'm doing it for the purpose of I have to be positioned today, tomorrow, the next day in the markets to make the right decisions. But politics and geopolitics and all of this economics all matter. So, what we see, and I measure it in statistics and probability. So you could see it in the book, or I did a YouTube video that also gives a condensed version of that called The Changing World Order. You can see the measurements, and you can see it happen repeatedly. And so that cycle, which if you like, I'll describe, that cycle has brought us to a point where there are consequences for the conditions that we find ourselves in. So, for example, today, financially, you have a situation where there's debt is a stimulant, another or credit. You provide credit, you get debt. And so when you need a lot of buying power, central banks inject a lot of money and credit. And when it's not, when they don't have a limit on it, like in some eras, it was gold that was a limit. And they would think, how much money do I have? And that would affect how much they spend. That is no longer the case. So that there is that stimulant, but that stimulant um, of creating credit creates debt, which is an obligation for paying back, and it is an asset for somebody on the other side to hold to think whether they're having a real return. So there's a mechanics to that set of circumstances that means when you have a lot of debt and you have a lot of assets and liabilities that are there, you have to make both sides happy. And so the situation that we're going through is very much that the coffers are empty. They needed to spend money, and they chose to spend a lot of money on debt, and that produced an inflation because it's buying power. It should not be surprising if you give everybody a lot of buying power, and it's much more than there is production, that'll produce a lot of inflation. And so now we are where we are, in which the central bank is tightening monetary policy. What that means is removing buying power. So you see a situation where prices are going up and the central bank will remove buying power. And that creates a stagflation environment. And we've seen that repeat over a period of time. Now, when that happens, at the same time as the second influence, that there's a lot of wealth gap and a lot of populism of each side, then there's a lot of conflict naturally, internal. And populism, where does populism come from? Studying history, we see these patterns. When Donald Trump was elected in 2016, and I wanted to understand why. And that was the first time a populist was elected in the United States under my experience. So I went back and studied populism. And populism occurs when a disenfranchised group says this is not working for me, and they want a fighter, not a compromiser, to be able to fight for them. And so traditionally, there are populists of the left and populists of the right. So we see this through history. You study the 30s, and you see the internal conflicts of fighters. And that threatens the system. It threatens democracy. Four major democracies in the 1930s went from democracies to autocracies because of that. And when that happens at the same time as there's comparable power between two great empires at odds, and there's fighters that they will tend to then fight because we do not have a judicial system, a global judicial system that resolves disputes. So that's the dynamic that you see, and I could take you through how it goes from one world order. It goes and preceding all those, each world order is a war for control, and then there's a cycle that happens until there's another war and a new world order, because the new world order is the new system dominated by the new dominant power. So we see that happen repeatedly, and we know where we are. We know where we are.
Is it fair to say we're at the beginning of that conflict already between the U.S. and China? And I know you say in the book there are five kinds of war, and maybe this won't be a military war, but is it fair to say we're already in that conflict has already begun?
Yes, what you see is, like I say, five types of war. So there's a trade war, there's a technology war, there's a geopolitical influence war, then there's a capital and economic war that accelerates when there is this great power conflict, because it's the weaponization of capital markets and economies that are actually used to hurt the other. For example, in Japan, in the United States, they froze the financial assets, and they then also embargoed oil that they couldn't get oil in. And so this economic warfare takes place. And then when the economic warfare becomes intolerable, then that often leads to a military war. For example, it was those military sanctions, that's economic warfare, that happened in Japan that led to Pearl Harbor beginning. That's a typical cycle. We know where we are. We don't necessarily have to go to cross those lines. Okay. So we do have our financial conditions, and we do have our internal conditions, which are leading to these irreconcilable differences. And we do have our international conditions in this economic warfare. But if the parties involved really understand these patterns and understand the cost of that and the cost of the war, then perhaps we can avoid them. I'm just trying to make people aware of the story that's repeated over and over again, and looks like where we are is in a almost a brink of very bad situation.
And part of what you say, being at this moment in time, is that the US dollar is at some real risk, right? It's been the reserve currency for the world. That's given the US government, the Federal Reserve, a lot of leeway to, for example, during the COVID crisis, print a lot of money and have massive fiscal stimulus. Uh, what do you think the implications are if you were talking to finance ministers of emerging economies or lower income, middle income countries? That, they've traditionally they've grown up just like all of us with the U.S. dollar as the main reserve currency of the world. What might it mean if there's currency devaluation of the dollar? What might it mean for them?
I think just to clarify the first point, and then I'll go on answer. Um, what you're describing is true of the three major reserve currencies. Okay, so it's true of the United States, it's true of Europe, it's true of Japan right now, all three major reserve currencies. For example, there's too much debt in Italy and too much debt in some other countries in Europe. And the circumstances that we're dealing with the ECB is the very similar thing, that they're caught between a rock and a hard place. Either this is going to be paid back with money that maintains its value, or there will be a printing of money and it'll be devalued. And that's what the Japanese monetary policy, and the same thing is happening around that. And that's very much like the 1930s. You could see in the 1930s that there were depreciations of currencies, and then they went more to gold. One currency depreciated against the other, and they all depreciated. And then they went to gold as the main medium of exchange, because gold is an asset that is not dependent on the printing of money. It has the intrinsic value, and so that's why they went to that. So I want to emphasize that this is not just a US dollar issue. This is a reserve currency issue. And we're in an environment where they are all our fiat currencies, meaning they're not backed by something. And when there's a lot of debt, it pays to print the money, because the alternative is when it's paid back in hard money, that means that reduces one man's spending as another man's income. And so it contracts spending and it produces a depression type situation. So that's the trade off that we face. And then when we deal with ministers, finance ministers of countries and emerging countries, which I do speak with, it's very important to try to think about the diversification of reserves. You start by thinking about, first, what are your liabilities in? What is your payments? What do I have to have? And then there's a question of doing the sensitivity analysis of what is the valuation like, and thinking about purchasing power, which also means inflation in terms of that, because the assets that you're holding, whether they're in dollars, euros, or yen, will have a return that's significantly below the inflation rate. So there will be, all of those reserves will lose buying power. So that's what holding debt will be like. And then to think about the element of diversification of reserves to some extent outside of even the reserve currencies, such as gold. And particularly if you just read history and you see, common sense, it means that there should be some amount of gold in the mix, but it all depends still on what the liabilities are to be able to hold the right mix.
Yeah, you have a line in the book where you talk about all currencies ultimately get devalued or die. And I guess you've gone back and looked at all the various currencies that have been around, and that's kind of the trajectory, right?
750 currencies I looked at over a few hundred years, and that's been true for them all. And it's all connected to the debt cycle because the buying, when the time comes and you put it in hard currency, even when there was backing in gold and others, they broke the pegs and they devalued and they printed money 100% of the time.
So, what do you think it means? Again, going back to finance ministers, who I know you're all these global four, you're speaking with them, they really value your input. They're trying to achieve certain health goals or education goals. They're trying to make those kinds of investments in their societies. And you talk a lot about it, those as kind of key factors of the strength of a country in your book. What might they be facing going forward here if their currencies are going to be devalued? They need to worry about, it sounds like, the global economy and how stable it's going to be. What do you think it means for the growth prospects and the development prospects of these countries?
The things I would like to emphasize are the fundamentals in a very simple way. And they're the same for an individual, they're the same for a company, and they're the same for a country, because a country is just the aggregate of those. First, are you earning more than you're spending? So, do you have a good income statement and balance sheet? And do you save well in the proper assets? Basics. Second, do you have internal conflict or harmony? Um, that do you have something that creates productivity? So history has shown that if you educate your population well, you can measure this, but at income, education levels. Education means income and also education in civility of how people behave with each other is very important because the worst disruptive facts or circumstances is when they're at odds with each other and it becomes dysfunctional. So first, are you have a good income statement and balance sheet? Second, do you have internal productive competition and harmony? And third, are you at risk of an international war? So as an investor, when I look around and say, where do I want to have my money nowadays? I look at those three things above all else. And of course, there are many indicators. Um, uh, you know, some when we deal with the developing world, there are many, many, many different circumstances, of course. What do you export? What do you import? All of those things. If you're exporting items that go up in value, commodities, and so on, your circumstances are different than if you're importing those. So I can't make a generalization. But what I can say is those three factors, the more volatility, of course, you have in your income, the more important it is that you have a savings rate and you have that diversification of reserves and good savings, especially in this time. We are shifting the world. We moved from a world that was primarily resources were allocated on the basis of economic conditions and profitability. So that if it was economic to produce someplace, the capital would go there. And those who would earn the money would raise their living standards and so on. This is changing now. That the political or the geopolitical is more important than the economic profit system in allocating resources. So, for example, because that happened, we got Donald Trump becoming a populist because there was loss of jobs and so on. And those who want to fight for him are then becoming um, exerting forces, whether it's protectionism or nationalism, that is having an effect. The fact that we have conflicts now between countries and the possibility of wars means that being self-sufficient for countries is more important than it was in the past, where we had a globalized economy where you would produce it and move it to the most efficient places. That's ending, not only because of the political aspects that I'm talking about for what it means in countries' incomes and so on, but also because of the need for self-sufficiency and the worries about foreign exchange controls or trade controls. For example, if you're producing in China, then there's the question: will that be sanctioned? Will you have the possibility, for example, that exports from China can be viewed like exports from Russia, and so companies that are producing there have these issues. So then they move or they operate in another way. So this is all very much less economic, less efficient in terms of the cost effectiveness. It contributes to a higher level of inflation, but it is part of this new world order.
Yeah, we keep hearing this term deglobalization. And it sounds like that's what you think we're entering into. Globalization seemed almost like the end of history, right? We were going to become this one globalized world with free trade. It sounds like you're saying that period has ended. Now it's about countries bringing manufacturing home, having more control over their commodity exports. It's about countries kind of looking more internally. Is that a fair
Yeah,
summation of
yes.
how you see it?
Internal conflict, and then even within that, the conflict issue, internal conflict and external conflict, will drive the resource allocation. So, what you'll see, even within countries, like within the United States, you are seeing movements from one state to another or one industry to another. So, you're seeing this bifurcation. The reason people are moving from California to Texas or New York or Chicago to Florida has to do with the ideologies and the economics of that. Partially it's tax, but it's also partially ideological. People are now bidding for the ideological forces. For example, Elon Musk's buying Twitter is not entirely a commercial transaction. It, whoever controls Twitter will probably have more impact on our society and its decisions than the Supreme Court. So there's a power that comes from these points of view and ideologies. And when you're having those conflicts, that's a bigger driver. And it's been true throughout history. I mean, when you come to wars or near war like situations, they become command economies because they can't just satisfy the consumption needs of those who can spend the most.
What do you think is the probability of that happening in the United States? I mean, you talk about that in the book, and you've been quoted many times talking about the prospect for some kind of a civil conflict in the United States, which obviously would affect the whole world. How likely do you think that is? And what would it look like?
I think that there's something like a 40% probability that you will have a type of irreconcilable differences by the system, um, leading to a type of civil war, meaning that law and democracy and our system as we know it doesn't uh, rule things. So, in other words, I could imagine that we have a situation where neither political party accepts losing. I can imagine that the um, governance from the central government is ignored. In other words, that Supreme Court decisions are not followed by state and local governments. That you get into a power thing. In other words, make me. In other words, what is your exertion of power? I'm not going to follow that. How are you going to make me do that? Now that's very dangerous because it not only does it fragment the country, but it also makes the question of you're having a type of warfare. Now, how far that goes Does that go to shooting? Does it not go to shooting? I mean, I don't think it goes to shooting. And I'm still only saying it's a 40% chance of this thing happening. I think we're at a juncture where we can change that. We can improve the odds. But let's say, but there are more guns in America than there are people. I mean, under the certain circumstances, who knows? I don't know where it goes, but I do think that it's a dangerously high probability. I don't make that up, that 40% number out of the air. I use leading indicators of statistics. Now, I don't have a large enough sample size to have a high level of confidence, but the fact that we have that. What happened in terms of the January 6th incident was not a surprise. Shouldn't be a surprise. It's right out of the populist handbook. So as you see these things, there's the worry of that, and then there's of course the international conflict, which I would say is also a 40% chance that you can have a type of international war. We went through where we are in terms of the wars and sanctions, and so on. Does that go to another level? I can't say. There are contentious issues, seeming irreconcilable differences, for example, over Taiwan and so on. So that there are, such issues. I think the main thing here, we're right at the brink of that. We're dangerously close. You and I never would have had a conversation like this not many years ago. The fact that we all are having this conversation is indicative of where we've gone. And so, but we have to remember that it's really up to us. It all depends on how we are with each other. We can do this. I believe personally that it's very important that there's a strong bipartisan middle. I think one of the political problems that you have is when you have two parties, of which a significant number of those might represent rather extreme points of view. There is not a pulling together. Still, the majority of Americans are in the middle, but the two political parties are more extreme. If you had a strong middle, almost a middle political party, and I'm not saying that's going to happen, but in other words, a platform and leadership for a strong middle of working together and achieving policies that deal with a number of issues. We have a number of issues that have to be dealt with. The education problem, the infrastructure problem, other things that stand in the way of productivity have to be dealt with, including probably constitutional amendments to help to bring those things about. So exists a possibility, but yes, it's a dangerously high probabilities of both of those things.
I'm curious what you think about democracy itself and its prospects, because this issue of populism, it's not just a US issue, right? It's rising all over the world. You connected a lot in your book to inequality and how it's growing. So when you think about the world today, there's more and more authoritarian regimes, there's fewer and fewer democratic ones. Do you think democracy itself maybe will suffer from this moment in history that you're seeing, from this ending of this one big cycle and the start of a new one? Is democracy an issue that you studied and looked at, and what
Yeah,
are the implications there?
if you go back to Plato's Republic and the cycle that is there, the big risk of democracy is anarchy, the fighting between the factions that puts the rule of law and the respect for democracy at risk. And if you look back in the 1930s, four major democracies chose autocracies because there was internal conflict. Germany, Italy, Spain, and Japan were all democracies, and they chose autocracies because the two sides fight. And somebody says, well, we need the strong to get control over it. There's an internal conflict, and you get an autocracy. So that's the normal pattern that it becomes threatened. In his case, then he goes on and he says, then what you have is the benevolent despot, the person who has a command economy, but does that smartly and out of care for the whole. And then that arises, and then the cycle goes on to have the bad despot who is corrupt and autocratic and makes it inefficient, and then that's bad. Then there's a revolution, and then when there's a revolution, then maybe it comes together and forms democracy, and there's this cycle. But it is certainly true that the risk of democracy is effective decision making due to this internal conflict.
Yeah, and I guess it makes you think about some of the autocracies themselves, right? Because the argument often is autocracies also don't hold together. And I wonder, when you think of China, do you see any of the similar underlying issues kind of under the surface? You know the country so well, you've been going there for decades now. Do you think they are going to be able to do what they sort of say they can do, which is have this long term plan and kind of ride the challenging waves in the world, whatever they are? Or do you think there's some chance of disruption in that country as well?
Um, in, in 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 all countries, there are this issue, and in all countries, if it is overdone, it's a delicate balance, and if it's not really balanced well, then there is that particular risk. And so, in the United States, where we have a democracy, the greater risk is this chaos and fighting with each other. In China, of course, there are still political differences and different points of view. So it depends how we're going to come into a political season. November is their change of the leadership. I don't mean necessarily Deng Xiaoping, but excuse me, Xi
Xi
Jinping.
Jinping, yeah.
But I mean that the Politburo and the changes of leadership. So there's a political at the top workings of how that's going to be worked out. But it is certainly true that if you over control and you overdo that and you don't do that in the right way, they call that the loss of the mandate of heaven. Because what happens is, in circumstances, when that doesn't work well, that loss of the mandate of heaven leads to turbulence and has led to changes in their world, in their order, their domestic order. So it's certainly, of course, a risk there, just as it is a risk here.
Yeah, and I guess we've talked a lot about how bad things can get, how bad things are, and you do say it's not over yet. We're at the brink, but there's things we can do, and I wonder if we could just talk about philanthropy for a second. Um, you're one of the wealthiest people in the world. You signed the Giving Pledge. You've been doing a lot of philanthropy. What are you thinking about in terms of the role of philanthropy, yours or maybe more broadly? I mean, do you have any kind of principles like you have in this book and as you had in others around how philanthropy could play a role in pulling us back from that brink, maybe in helping to bring countries together internally, address some of these global issues like climate change? What's your feeling with the role of philanthropy here?
Um, I can go into what we're doing and also what the principles are, because I always write down these principles, and there are guiding principles. But the main thing that my immediate reaction to your question is it's woefully inadequate. It's woefully inadequate. The issues that we're dealing with, like one of the things that we're trying to do, my wife does this 6 days a week, is in various ways try to get programs and things that get high school kids in eighth and ninth grade to get them through high school and into work, in the state of Connecticut. Okay. I'll give you a statistic. The state of Connecticut is one of the richest states on average, but has a big wealth gap. 22% of the high school students are either disengaged or disconnected. Disengaged means the absentee rate is greater than 25% and they're failing classes. And disconnected means that they don't know where they are because they've dropped out of school. In other words, more than 1 in 5 students, high school is failing. And they're failing high school. And the budget issues are a problem. I live in Greenwich, Connecticut, and it's a rich town. The average per student for public high school is $24,000. You go up the hill and 15 minutes away, and it's Bridgeport, Connecticut. It's a poor town, and it's $14,000 a student. They need more money because there's hunger, there's bad conditions. They need more money than Greenwich, Connecticut, and yet they're getting significantly less. So what's the natural consequence of that? The parents who are raised under these very impossible, the kids become parents, and they're raised under these circumstances. And what is their community and what is their income? Their community is the gangs, because that's their community. That's the one they can relate to. That, and everybody needs a community. And what are their income? It's crime, in one form or another. And there are gangs and shootings all the time. And we're in a situation where, of course, that creates not only the crime costs, but it also creates high incarceration costs. The state pays $600 million a year for incarceration. So you create a cycle. In order to break that cycle, you need everything from early childhood education all the way through that. Yeah, and that has to make an improvement. Yeah, and that's why I say you might even need reforms to the Constitution, because the state education is a state issue, and in the states they tend to make it a tax district issue. And so there's no way that you're going to get that. Now, the cost of that bad education is immense for the country, because not only is it unfair, but also you don't know where the talent is going to come from. Throughout history, you find that the most talented people can come from anywhere. And there's only basic things you need to have. What I had when I was growing up, I was very lucky. I had two parents who cared for me. They were good guidance. I went to a public school, and I came out to a country of equal opportunity. So I could work hard, and that was it. And we need to, I think, in one way or another, establish that there's a bottom that nobody can go below, and to realize that those are good investments. The same is true for infrastructure. There's no inadequate infrastructure. My generation has given the next generation a lot of debt, a broken down education system, and a broken down infrastructure. So that's going to require a lot. So my general reaction is philanthropy is woefully inadequate.
What about those principles? I'm interested to hear what are some of the principles you apply to your own philanthropy.
Well, I chose to make it a family activity, not a mandatory family activity, but an activity in which each individual has their own particular passion. And I'm not, and it shouldn't be, in our case, by the way, I'm not saying this is right for others. I'm just saying with the choices that we've made. What we think about is, um, just let's escape a world in which we're thinking about profits, and just think about what you want to accomplish. And rather than accumulating income has no purpose, because there's no intrinsic value. And the only value is in what you do with your money. So when you step back and you say, okay, now what do you want to do with your money in terms of those things? And you realize that money has diminishing returns for you, and it has enormous benefit for others in other ways, then there's how you go about doing that. So we do it as a family activity, and we have a series of rules. In other words, how much you can give is a function of how much experience, how you've done it in the past, what are the credentials, the skills that you've built up, but it is your activity. So we pursue various activities that are extensions of the passions of those, and then we sort of break that down. What do we do for our community? What do we do for individuals? What do we do for the environment? And so my wife and I have a disproportionate amount of that giving. But as we view this over a period of time, the others are giving, and then they make that, and then we have to know how to give, and that's challenging, because if you make an investment in a company, you know if it's working or not, because you judge it by profit, and drop profit, stock price, that kind of thing. But when you're giving away philanthropy, there's not a common unit of measurement. So you have to think about what is the impact, and then what are the types of ways you can give. In some areas, we can be involved and write a check to the right people who are doing things better than we will ever do them, and that's great. In some cases, we take on the initiative of being the organization that, and so you have to build a staff, and you have to run a staff of how to do that. So we have criterion that lets us think, how do we measure success? And also, how do we allocate resources between those, what is special that we have to bring? Are we going to bring understanding? Are we going to bring money? And where are the passions? So that's all kind of systemized in terms of a series of rules and measures and so on that are guidances, but not so much so that it impinges on the freedoms, but a lot. So and that's a joy because we like the family activities. We go to each other's events, and it brings our family closer to be able to share those. So that's kind of, I could go on at length, but I don't want to take too long on your answer to your question. But that's basically how we approach it.
And we are getting a little short on time here, but just a quick follow up to that. What about impact investing? I mean, given your incredible experience in investing in general for profit, where does impact investing fit in? Do you do any of it? What do you think of it?
Yeah, impact investing, when you can get it done terrifically, is the best investing. The question is, how much income do you give up or do you not give up for the second bottom line? And then how do you measure the second bottom line? So it becomes a measurement question. For example, let's say I could earn 10% more in an economic investment than, let's say, a double bottom line. Then I think I can take that 10% and I can donate 10% more. So I seek to try to measure, okay, what is that impact? Of course, measurement is more difficult. So there's a certain art. So we're experimenting a lot with impact investing, and we found some very good. But so far, it's difficult to scale. A lot of demand for it. A lot of funds developed for it. But the rigor of it has not been very good because of a lot of the definition. What is an impact investing? And what gets the stamp? In other words, if I don't know, for example, somebody could say, if I invest in a bowling alley, I'm giving people exercise. I mean, I'm just giving that as a silly example. But in other words, how do you measure those impacts and really what it is? So it's a terrific concept. It's emerging. It's good, but it is in its early stages and it's difficult to measure.
Well, you've given us so much to think about, Ray, as we think about the future, the context, what it's all going to mean for people working in health and education, and other issues connected to the Sustainable Development Goals. And the book, I've really got to commend it because it's not just your ideas, it's actually based on a lot of data. You've got lots of charts and graphs you can go through, which are really clear, and they kind of show the trends that you're talking about over a very long time cycle. So it's a really interesting piece of work. I know it's doing so well around the world. I just really congratulate you on the book, and thank you for taking some time to be with us here at Devex World. Again, the book is called Principles for Dealing with a Changing World Order: Why Nations Succeed and Fail. Ray Dalio, thanks for being with us today at Devex
I'll
World.
mention, sorry for the interruption, I'll
Yeah,
mention one other thing that's very easy for people to do because the book may not get it there. So I did an animated video that's called The Changing World Order on YouTube. I put it out a little over a month ago. It's got 14 million views. It's a very easy and entertaining way of getting the story. So if somebody cares to see it that way, they can do it that way too. And let me thank you very much because we have this common interest of trying to do things in the best possible way. So I appreciate you and I doing this together.
thank you, Ray. Thank you. And I watched the video. My kids have watched the video. I recommend it too.